I should note before we go any further a couple things. Number one, we are pre-recording this segment several days before broadcast, so you may, in fact, undoubtedly do know more than we do at this very moment about, for example, what Donald Trump decided to do regarding Syria and other military developments. But given the fact that John Bolton has just taken office as National Security Advisor, there are other transitions taking place in the Trump administration, and we stand at the precipice of additional military conflict potentially, I thought it was more important than ever to bring on our next guest, who I've been looking forward to speaking with for some time. Major Danny Sjursen is a U.S. Army strategist and former history instructor at West Point, although I should add that he joins us not as a representative of the Defense Department or the military, but speaking on his own. He is the author of a combination memoir and critical analysis of the war in Iraq entitled Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surgery. And he recently wrote a piece entitled The Dolls of Militarism about what's going on with our military strategy or lack thereof. And so I wanted to talk about that with him. So first of all, Danny, thank you for coming on the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to talk about this, and just think it's a really important time. And there's so much happening right now that it's really hard to keep up.
It is hard to keep up. It's a constantly set of moving targets, and as we look at when we look at Syria, we're not thinking about Yemen. When we think about Yemen, we're not thinking about our continued presence in Afghanistan or Iraq. But it seems, you talk about Trump's continued cabinet reshuffling. You compare the situation there to Russian nesting dolls, the matryoshki, but you're basically saying every time he opens one up, there's a more militaristic version of it inside, or more hawkish. But I don't get a strategy. I just get a series of uncoordinated reactions based on biases and postures. What do you see?
I see much the same. What we have is a series of 7 hot wars. Okay, in 2016, in the last year under Obama, we bombed 7 countries, and we have soldiers in 70% of the countries around the world. The Trump administration has really not changed that policy significantly. If it's changed at all, it's been some minor escalations in Afghanistan. Too often, Americans look at our 7 shooting wars, Syria, Yemen, Libya, etc., as discrete entities, when the reality is they're very much connected. Now, they're not connected in any sober grand strategy or prudent operations. They're connected in the sense that they're all drifting. They're all taking on a momentum and an inertia of their own. So we have Afghanistan, where we've been at war for 17 years, and I spent a year there in 2011 and 12. On one end, and then now we're back in Iraq. We are escalating in Syria, and it looks like we're postured for another tough guy act, which is to try to take some retribution on Bashar al-Assad. All that being said, what I am not seeing is a strategy that indicates how we intend to gain safety or security through our operations in a place like, say, Syria.
Well, and that's part of what disturbs me. I mean, if we just take Syria as an example, regardless of what happens in the next few days, I think you rightly point out that this is not something that's unique to Donald Trump. It was taking place in the Obama administration. Some of these hot wars, of course, were initiated by the Bush administration. But taking Syria as an example, we oppose Assad, we're told, and we oppose the Russians who are helping Assad, but we also oppose many of the forces arrayed against Assad because they are ISIS-connected or Al-Qaeda connected. So just taking Syria in isolation, assuming that Trump lobs some more missiles at it or does something short of putting troops on the ground there, which seems unlikely, what we've got seems to me to be, I don't get where we are, where we're going. I'd like to know if in any one of these 7 hot wars you mentioned, someone can tell us, and you allude to this, what winning looks like.
So let's start with Syria. I've written several articles about Syria. I have another one coming out. And here's the first question I'll ask the listeners, which is this. How many Americans do you think realize that even before the latest crisis with Russia and Assad, that the United States is the proud owner of 1/3 of Syria? That's right. We have 2,000 soldiers on the ground, ample air power in the air, and we're backing Kurdish militias in the eastern third, the northeastern third of Syria. Now, this individual instance in Syria is perhaps the most alarming, and it's very representative of our strategic drift elsewhere. Let me tell you why. Today, along the Euphrates River, which essentially divides American-backed forces and American advisors from the enemy or adversary, the United States is staring down Russian soldiers and advisors, Iranian soldiers and advisors, Hezbollah and other Shia militias, as well as Assad's military. Now, it wouldn't take very much, a mistake, some sort of errant airstrike, to cause a major regional war in the area. To the northwest of American defenses along the Euphrates River, we have the Turks. Now, the Turks are a NATO ally with the second largest military in NATO, and yet they're attacking the very militias that we've been backing. What happens if an American advisor is killed in a Turkish airstrike or by a Turkish tank? So that's where we were. That was the very precarious situation we were in before all the latest drama with the alleged chemical attack in eastern Ghouta. I'm very concerned about the language on both sides, because now, and maybe our listeners, because it's pre-recorded, will know more than we do. But as it stands right now, President Trump has said over Twitter, of course, that there will be missiles flying at Syria. And President Putin and Lavrov and basically Moscow have replied by saying, we're going to shoot them down. If you try to target Syrian forces and put our advisors at risk, we're going to shoot them down. So here's where we stand at the precipice of potential disaster. ... What's the strategic gain? Now, it's absolutely terrible what's been happening to civilians in Syria. That's not the question, though. It's absolutely terrible that Assad is a brutal dictator. Well, we back lots of dictators, like the king of Saudi Arabia. The question is, what is the strategic interest of the United States? What is our policy, and how does it reflect American interests? I would argue that in Syria, we've drifted so far off course that we no longer have a handle on the strategic situation.
Well, and I would, also it's worth, I think, and of course, tell me if you disagree, but it's also worth putting that in context and pointing out that we have this crisis in Syria because we went into the Iraq and elsewhere without a clear end game in those situations. So not only is a military action without a clear strategy a horrible idea and putting our own folks in harm's way for no clear purpose, at least as I see it, but it can create further, as you point out with Syria, perhaps enormous consequences that we then have to deal with, and then, if history is any lesson, we'll deal with without any clear strategy there either. I mean, that's another kind of nesting doll problem, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I served in Iraq in 2006 and 2007 for 15 months during the first surge in Iraq, the alleged surge that allegedly brought victory to the United States, which of course is a myth, and my book speaks about that. I taught cadets, freshmen, United States history in 2014, 15, and 16. My first crop of students will graduate this May and may very well find itself in the very same places that I have spent my career: Afghanistan, Iraq, now Syria. That's very disturbing for me on a personal level, but also on a professional level. You mentioned Iraq, and I would have to say the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 will stand as the original sin of the American war in the Middle East. It is from the war in Iraq that al-Qaeda spread into Iraq itself. It had not been there in any real form prior to our invasion. And it is the Frankenstein's monster of that war, which is ISIS. ISIS grows up in our prisons in response to our occupation as an Islamist and nationalist uprising against American military occupation of an Arab state. This is the reality. We've created this problem. During the election campaign, Donald Trump used to like to say, well, Obama, he's the founder of ISIS. And obviously that's ludicrous. But U.S. actions in Iraq, U.S. policies in our prisons did create this monster. And so now we're fighting it. And now it has spread across to Syria. And now ISIS has opened franchises in eastern Afghanistan and in northern Libya. Now, I'm not saying we need to put ground troops in all these places. What I'm saying is we have to look at our past mistakes and ask ourselves the question, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Yemen, do we want to escalate further? Or are we going to have counterproductive activity because of our actions? I would argue in most cases, the answer is to do less in the Middle East, because the second and third order effects are very rarely, very, very rarely positive for the United States.
And again, we're talking with Major Danny Sjursen, speaking on his own behalf, not the Defense Department's, about events in the Middle East. So, Danny, I feel, as if the military, and probably it's written in the military code somewhere, but I feel the military should have and has had at times in the past the sort of Hippocratic Oath principle of first do no harms. And I certainly feel that that's what you're saying here, is that as tragic as what we're seeing in certain parts of Syria today is, it's just horrendous. That if by acting we create more harm than we address, then we should refrain from acting until we have a way of helping and not hurting. Fair enough?
Absolutely. Yeah, I like the idea of the Hippocratic Oath. U.S. military policy is hard. Okay, if it was easy, then we would just send our troops to every single problem spot. The reality is we have to be very prudent about where we use our military, how we use it, and be careful not to further sully the American name on the Arab street and appear as neo-imperial occupiers, because all too often we've actually created more Islamists than we can kill. And that may sound like a crude way of looking at it, but it's an important decision. It's a risk-reward analysis. I would argue that Syria today is all risk, almost no reward.
So can you envision, Danny, a constructive policy in Syria? Would it be one that says back off on the military intervention, diplomacy and humanitarian aid, and getting all the parties involved, including Russia and the U.S. around a table? Is it something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there has to be a grand settlement in Syria. And again, of course, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the United States Army. I'm speaking as a scholar and as a writer. And what I think is we have to realize Assad has won the civil war in Syria, like it or not. He owns almost all the major cities. He owns the major thoroughfares. He owns the Mediterranean coast. Assad's not going anywhere, at least not unless the United States puts major ground forces and risks an all-out war with Russia. So we do have to pursue diplomacy. Humanitarian aid is probably worth 3 times as much as military spending in terms of output. And I would argue that it's time for the countries in the region who are more threatened by ISIS, or what's left of ISIS, and extremism than we are. Okay, so I think that our partners, so to speak, in the Middle East have to step in and do their best to stabilize, for example, eastern Syria. Here's the fear. The longer the United States military remains on the ground in Syria, the more the people in that area are going to expect us to fix their problems. When you break something, you buy it. Now, we didn't break eastern Syria on our own, but we were part of it. And now we own the hopes, the dreams, the wishes, and the well-being of those people. And the longer the United States military stays, the more we look like occupiers, and I would argue we're going to face an insurgency, if not the breakout of an accidental war along the Euphrates River with Iran, Turkey, or Russia.
Well, I think that's a great summary. We didn't even really get to talk about the Trump administration and the changing of the guard from bad to worse there as much as I'd like, but in the minute or so we have left, I will point out that not only that this administration is elevating Islamophobes at a time when our mission should be to repair the breaches in the Muslim world. We're basically declaring ourselves the enemies of Islam, which is exactly what I would say actors like ISIS want us to do, but plays right into their hands. But we are also, it's amazing to me how people who were so wrong about Afghanistan strategy, so wrong about invading Iraq, they still get elevated to these positions in the media and in government, apparently there's no penalty for being wrong in the strategy game.
Absolutely. Well, Bolton and Pompeo in particular concern me, and that's what I wrote about in the article. Here's something to think about. John Bolton, for example, as National Security Advisor, may be the most important advisor on military policy in the president's cabinet. He has been wrong about every single major foreign policy issue for the last 17 years, and there are no consequences. You get a job at Fox News, the president sees you, he puts you in this important position. Pompeo is an Islamophobe who's taken money from Islamophobic organizations, spoken at them, and has been hawkish on every major foreign policy issue ever since he's been elected to Congress. Again, there is no penalty for being wrong about all these things in the Middle East. Here's what worries me. If bin Laden was alive, and you can be sure his successor is cheering the appointment of people like Bolton and Pompeo, you can bet that what's left of ISIS is cheering the appointment of people like Pompeo and Bolton. The reason being is because they are so well known as Islamophobes that they are more likely to get the United States ever deeper into the quagmire in the Middle East, which is exactly what al-Qaeda was hoping for with their initial attacks on 9/11. Don't take my word for it. Do a little research and find out. Osama bin Laden wrote that. He was hoping to pull the military of the United States into the Middle East, into a quagmire from which it could very, very much have difficulty extricating itself.
So we have a situation, and unfortunately we're going to have to conclude, but we have a situation where ISIS and al-Qaeda and other entities have been trying to convince the world's 1.2 billion peaceful Muslims that there is no gray zone, that it is a war between Islam and the West, and we have a Trump administration apparently determined to bolster that argument. It's not a good recipe for the future, but Danny Sjursen, writer and historian and military strategist, thanks for your great writing on this topic, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me, and I'll be keeping it up.